What if the fastest way to bring a country to its knees isn't a bomb, it's a bridge? On one single night in July 2026, the United States didn't just strike a target inside Iran, it cut the country in half. Before we go any further, if you actually want to understand this war, instead of just scrolling past another confusing headline, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell. This story is moving fast. New developments are landing almost every day, and I don't want you to miss the next piece of it. Let's set the scene properly because this moment didn't come out of nowhere. For months now, the United States and Iran have been locked in a slow, escalating conflict centered on one of the most valuable strips of water on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. This didn't begin in July, it goes back to February when a fragile understanding between the two countries collapsed and a full military campaign began. Since then, there have been waves of strikes, brief pauses, a short-lived interim agreement that fell apart within weeks, and then more strikes on top of that. It has been a cycle of escalation, retreat, and escalation again. And by the middle of July, that cycle reached the stage nobody had quite seen before. On the night of July 17th, American forces expanded their air campaign in a way that broke from everything that came before it. Instead of hitting radar stations, missile depots, or command centers, the usual military targets in a conflict like this, the U.S. struck the roads and rail lines connecting Bandar Abbas, Iran's most important port city, to the rest of the country. Multiple bridges came down in a single night. A railway junction west of the city was hit. A port control tower collapsed. According to Iranian officials, dozens of people were killed and hundreds more injured across the wave of strikes surrounding this operation. This wasn't a scattered, chaotic bombing run. It was a deliberate, coordinated cut aimed at one specific outcome, isolating a city from the country it belongs to. Now stop and actually think about what Bandar Abbas is. It isn't just another coastal town with a harbor. It's the home base of Iran's naval forces along the Gulf. It's the country's largest commercial port. Everything that needs to move by sea in and out of southern Iran passes through it. Fuel, weapons, military equipment, food, medicine, consumer goods. Everything an economy needs to keep breathing. And the roads and railways leading out of that city aren't just convenient. They are, in a very real sense, the only way to get any of it to the rest of the nation. You can have a warehouse full of missiles. You can have fuel sitting in storage tanks. None of it matters if there's no road left to move it on. Destroy those connections, and you don't just damage some concrete and steel. You sever a supply chain that an entire province, and by extension, an entire military depends on. That's exactly what happened on the ground. Provincial officials in Hormozgan confirmed that roads leading into Bandar Abbas had been blocked in the immediate aftermath of the strikes. Traffic eventually crept back to life days later, but residents were told to avoid any travel that wasn't absolutely necessary and to keep the routes clear for emergency crews. And in a detail that tells you just how serious this had become, Iran's own energy ministry publicly asked people across the southern provinces to cut back on their electricity use. For the first time in this entire war, Iranian officials openly admitted, in their own words, that the country's power infrastructure had taken damage from the strikes. That is not a small thing to say out loud. Governments do not usually volunteer information that makes them look weaker, unless the situation on the ground leaves them with no other choice. When a state broadcaster starts telling its own citizens to ration electricity because of enemy strikes, that's not spin anymore, that's an admission. Think about what that admission actually costs a government to make. Every single day of this war, Iranian officials have had to balance two competing instincts: project strength to their own population, and be honest enough that people trust what they're being told during a genuine emergency. Choosing to publicly confirm damage to the power grid tells you which instinct won out this time. It tells you that the pressure on the ground had become impossible to hide behind carefully worded statements. Picture what this actually looks like for a family living in Hormozgan province right now. It's the middle of summer. Temperatures in that part of southern Iran regularly climb well past 40 degrees Celsius, and the government is asking people to use less air conditioning at the exact moment strikes have made travel dangerous and unpredictable. Hospitals still need power for equipment that cannot simply be switched off. Water pumps still need electricity to keep running. None of that stops just because a war is happening around it. This is the quiet, unglamorous side of a bridge campaign like this one. The side that never makes it into a single dramatic headline, but adds up to real hardship for people who never had any say in how this war started or how it continues. Here's the part that makes this moment feel different from almost everything that came before it in this conflict. Bridges are not weapons. They are not missile silos, radar arrays, or naval bases. They are the roads people drive their kids to school on. They are the paths trucks use to deliver food to markets, the routes ambulances take to hospitals, the connections that let ordinary families visit relatives in the next town over. When a war moves from targeting an army's weapons to targeting a country's basic infrastructure, something fundamentally shifts in its character. It stops being a fight between two militaries and starts becoming something that touches millions of people who have absolutely nothing to do with the fighting. And once that line gets crossed, it becomes very hard to walk it back. You can rebuild trust after a missile exchange between soldiers. It's a different kind of damage when a country's basic transportation network gets dismantled piece by piece. This wasn't even the first time a bridge became a flashpoint in this war. Back in early April, a strike hit a newly completed bridge near Tehran, one of the tallest structures of its kind in the entire region, part of an ambitious highway project meant to connect the capital to the Caspian coast. That strike killed several people and injured dozens more, and it triggered a wave of international criticism over the targeting of civilian infrastructure. So when bridges came down again in July, this time around Bandar Abbas, it wasn't some isolated one-off tactic. It was a pattern repeating itself just on a much larger scale. And patterns tell you a great deal about strategy. A single strike on a bridge might be an accident of war, a target of opportunity. Multiple strikes on multiple bridges months apart aimed at connecting cities to their capital and their coastline start to look like a deliberate doctrine. None of this is happening in a vacuum either. The Strait of Hormuz has been a flashpoint for decades. Back in the 1980s, during the long war between Iran and Iraq, the region went through what history now calls the Tanker War, when both sides began targeting oil shipments moving through the Gulf, eventually pulling the United States Navy directly into the fight to protect commercial traffic. More recently, in 2019, a string of mysterious attacks on tankers near the strait pushed tensions to a boiling point without ever tipping into full-scale war. Every time this waterway has become a battleground, the same basic truth has held steady. Whoever controls the flow of ships through it holds leverage far beyond the size of their military. What makes this current chapter different is the sheer scale and speed of it. This isn't a mysterious attack every few months that gets debated in the news for a week. This is a sustained, near-daily campaign with land and sea targets being hit in the same coordinated rhythm night after night for weeks on end. Put those two moves side by side and the strategy becomes obvious. A blockade at sea, bridges destroyed on land. Two completely different tools aimed at the exact same target. Iran's ability to move anything at all, whether it's oil going out to the rest of the world or supplies coming in to keep the country running. The land campaign didn't happen in isolation either. Just one night before the bridges fell, the United States reimposed a full naval blockade around Iran's ports, warning every ship in the region to stay far away from Iranian oil terminals. Most captains listened immediately, one didn't. A tanker sailing toward Karg Island, which is Iran's primary oil export terminal, ignored repeated warnings from American forces and kept moving toward the coast. American aircraft responded by firing missiles directly into the ship's smokestack, disabling its engines without rupturing the fuel tanks or spilling oil into the Gulf. Nobody on board was hurt, but the message traveled instantly to every other tanker captain watching from anywhere in the region. Try to slip through this blockade and you will be caught and you will be stopped, whether your cargo is empty or full. Iran did not stay silent after any of this. In the days that followed, Iranian forces launched retaliatory strikes against American allies hosting U.S. troops across the region. Bahrain was hit, Kuwait was hit, Jordan was hit, Qatar was hit. In Qatar's case, stings just a little more than the others because Qatar has spent much of this war trying to mediate a peace deal between the two sides. Being struck by the very country you're trying to help bring to the negotiating table is its own kind of message. And in Kuwait, one of those strikes hit something that had never been targeted in this conflict before, a power and water desalination facility. Kuwait accused Iran of deliberately striking civilian and essential infrastructure, and it's easy to understand why that accusation landed so hard. A desalination plant isn't a military target in any traditional sense. It's how an entire small desert nation gets its clean drinking water. When strikes start landing on something like that, the war stops being contained to soldiers and starts touching people who never signed up to be part of any of this in a country that isn't even the one fighting. If you're finding this useful, do me a quick favor and tap that like button before you keep scrolling. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are trying to actually understand what's happening in the world right now instead of just reacting to whatever headline crosses their feed. So, where does that leave things as this stretch of the war unfolds? A naval blockade back in full force at sea. The road and rail network into Iran's most important port left in ruins. A desalination plant damaged inside an allied nation, and an Iranian government publicly admitting for the first time in this entire conflict that its own power grid has taken real damage. Each of those facts on its own would be a major story. Put together in the span of just a few days, they paint a picture of a war that has expanded far beyond where it started back in February. Now let's talk about what all of this pressure is actually doing to Iran's ability to keep fighting, because the numbers here are hard to ignore. Multiple trackers following the pace of Iranian missile launches say the daily rate has dropped sharply compared to just a few weeks earlier. We're talking about a fraction of what it used to be. Analysts studying this pattern believe it's a direct result of the blockade and the bridge strikes working together, not as two separate campaigns, but as one coordinated squeeze. And think about the simple logic behind it. If the roads connecting missile production sites and storage depots to the coast are destroyed and the ports themselves are locked down by an active naval blockade, then brand new weapons simply cannot reach the places they need to be launched from. It doesn't matter how advanced a missile is if it's sitting in a warehouse 300 kilometers from where it needs to fire. This is not a single dramatic knockout blow the way a massive airstrike on a capital city might be. It's slower than that, and in some ways, more effective. A strategy built on patience, wearing down an opponent's ability to fight one supply route at a time without a single American soldier ever setting foot on Iranian soil. Then there's a claim from President Trump himself that made headlines for a genuinely strange reason. Speaking at a NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey in early July, Trump told reporters that Iran had fired over 100 missiles. He specifically said 100 of them at the USS Abraham Lincoln, an American aircraft carrier stationed in the region, all within about a 1-hour window. He said every single missile was intercepted before it ever came close to hitting the ship. Here's the strange wrinkle in that moment. In the middle of telling the story, Trump referred to the country that supposedly fired the missiles as the Islamic Republic of Japan. It's an obvious mix-up that was quickly picked up and reported by multiple outlets around the world. It's almost certainly a simple case of him meaning to say Iran and misspeaking under the pressure of a live press conference. Setting that slip aside for a moment, the core claim itself, a mass missile attack on the Lincoln that was fully intercepted, every single one, has not been independently confirmed by the Pentagon. And it's worth remembering that back in March, when Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed to have struck that exact same carrier with ballistic missiles, U.S. Central Command flatly denied it at the time, stating publicly that the missiles never even came close to the ship. So the specific number, 111, deserves a healthy dose of skepticism. But the broader picture is pointing toward an iron one that American naval defenses in the region successfully intercepting incoming threats at a very high rate does line up with a much larger military buildup that isn't in dispute at all. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has been operating in the region since January, backed by Arleigh Burke-class destroyers carrying their own sophisticated missile defense systems, with the 2nd Carrier Strike Group also active nearby in the same theater. According to reporting on troop levels across the Middle East, the United States now has more than 50,000 personnel stationed in the region, a noticeable jump from the roughly 40,000 that's typically kept there during normal non-crisis periods. Recent deployments have included an amphibious assault ship carrying thousands of additional Marines along with advanced fighter jets, and this entire buildup is being described by regional observers as the largest American military presence in the Middle East since the Iraq War. Officials describe these forces as being on high alert. Whether that means the posture is purely defensive, protecting existing assets and shipping lanes, or whether it's preparation for something considerably larger, nobody in an official capacity is saying for certain. But it's exactly the kind of number and exactly the kind of buildup that keeps regional analysts checking the news every single morning. It's also worth remembering that this isn't the first time a claim about the Abraham Lincoln has stirred up confusion in this war. Back in March, Iran's Revolutionary Guard put out its own version of events, claiming naval drone units had struck the carrier in the Sea of Oman as it sailed close to Iranian waters, and that the ship had been forced to retreat more than 1,000 kilometers afterward. The American military rejected that account within hours, calling it a lie, insisting the carrier had never been hit at all. So, on both sides of this conflict, we've now seen claims about this one aircraft carrier that don't fully hold up under scrutiny. One from Tehran claiming a hit that Washington denies ever happened, and one from Washington describing an interception at a scale nobody has been able to independently verify. A tug of war over a single ship says a lot about how both governments are using this conflict for messaging at home, not just fighting it on the ground. Meanwhile, back on the coast, one specific location keeps coming up again and again throughout this entire campaign: the port control tower in Chabahar. This wasn't the first time it had been struck. According to reporting, it had already been hit in earlier rounds of this conflict, and in this latest wave, it was reported destroyed. Alongside it, smaller roads connecting nearby towns and villages to the same coastal supply routes were also hit in the same operation. None of this destruction is being carried out with a single weapon system. It's a coordinated mix of fighter jets, aerial drones, and warships all watching the same stretch of coastline and the same roads feeding into it, often simultaneously. Long-range reconnaissance drones can loiter over a single target for hours before any decision to strike. It's even made covering far more ocean and coastline than any individual ship or aircraft could watch alone. Some of these platforms are built to operate largely undetected for extended stretches of time. And rather than sinking ships outright, the preferred method increasingly appears to be disabling them without destroying them completely. Exactly the same approach used against that tanker near Karg Island earlier in the story. That distinction matters far more than it might seem on the surface. A disabled ship sends a clear, unmistakable warning without creating a full-blown international incident. A sunk ship, especially one flying another country's flag, risks becoming exactly that kind of incident, dragging in governments that had nothing to do with the original dispute. Put all of that together, a missile rate that's fallen off sharply, a blockade with real demonstrated consequences for anyone who tries to break it, a supply network into Iran's most important port left in pieces, a control tower destroyed for what appears to be a repeat occurrence, and a sitting American president publicly discussing carrier-scale missile attacks being intercepted at what he claims is nearly a 100% success rate. Put it all together, and you start to understand why analysts are describing this stretch of the war as a genuine turning point, rather than just another chaotic news cycle that will be forgotten in a week. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about getting the real picture instead of just skimming the surface. So, do me one small thing. Leave a comment telling me which part of this surprised you the most. I read every single one, and honestly, it shapes what I dig into for the next video. Now let's step back and ask the bigger question that ties every single piece of this together. What is Iran actually trying to achieve here? Publicly, Tehran has framed this entire conflict as purely defensive, protecting its sovereignty, resisting outside pressure, standing firm against what it repeatedly calls foreign aggression. That's the official language, and it's worth taking seriously as one side of the argument. But a growing number of analysts watching the pattern of events over the past several months believe the real underlying goal is something considerably bigger than winning any individual battle. It's long-term durable influence over the Strait of Hormuz itself, not just temporary control during wartime that evaporates the moment a ceasefire gets signed. The numbers explain exactly why that prize is worth fighting this hard for. Roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply moves through this one narrow waterway every single day. Think about that for a second. Every fifth barrel of oil the planet uses, from gas stations in the United States to factories in Germany to power plants in Japan, at some point passes through this specific stretch of water squeezed between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. A country that could hold real, lasting leverage over that passage without ever needing to fully close it would gain enormous influence over the global economy simply through the constant possibility of disruption. Missiles ready to fire at a moment's notice. Patrol boats ready to harass any shipping that doesn't cooperate. A shadow fleet of unmarked tankers ready to move oil in ways that dodge international sanctions and rules entirely. Analysts have started calling this a toll booth strategy. Iran doesn't need to fully block the strait to gain real power from it. It only needs the rest of the world to believe that it could at any moment if it were pushed far enough. That idea reframed something that happened earlier this year in a completely different light. When Iranian forces attacked commercial vessels despite an active ceasefire, it was initially described by many observers as a miscalculation, an isolated mistake made in the fog of a fragile, still-forming peace. Looking back now, a growing number of analysts see it very differently, as a deliberate test designed to find out whether the United States would actually respond with real force, or whether it would quietly look the other way to protect a shaky peace deal that everyone knew was hanging by a thread. Based on everything that's happened since that moment, the reinstated blockade, day after day of continuous strikes, command infrastructure destroyed, and now bridges connecting Iran's most important port reduced to rubble, the answer to that test looks unmistakably clear. The United States did not look away. It answered with a scale of force that by most measures exceeded what came before the ceasefire in the first place. For Iran, this likely was not the outcome its leadership was betting on when it decided to test the boundaries of that fragile agreement. The strategy built on pushing limits while staying just below the threshold of full-scale all-out war appears, at least for now, to have badly backfired. Missile output has dropped sharply. Supply routes into its most important port are cut. Its ability to move oil through unofficial sanction-dodging channels is under direct and demonstrated threat, as shown clearly by that tanker strike near Karg Island. By nearly every asset visible measure available to outside observers, Iran finds itself in a materially weaker position than it was in just a few months ago before this latest round of escalation even began. And yet, it would be a genuine mistake to assume any of this means the war is close to winding down. Iran's core strategic ambition, long-term influence over the world's single most important oil choke point, hasn't changed just because its immediate tools for pursuing that goal have been degraded. Even from a weakened position, Iran may keep searching for new pressure points, proxy forces operating across the wider region. Whatever remains of its shadow fleet and its ability to move oil quietly around sanctions, or fresh attempts to test the edges of any future ceasefire, the exact same way it tested this one. Meanwhile, the American posture looks firm for the time being with more than 50,000 troops in the region, multiple active carrier strike groups, and officials treating an open, unrestricted Strait of Hormuz as something close to a non-negotiable priority for the entire global economy. This increasingly looks less like a short-term military reaction to a single provocation and more like a long-term strategic commitment that could shape the region for years. There's another layer to all of this worth sitting with carefully because it's easy to lose in the flood of strategic analysis and troop numbers. International law has fairly clear rules about targeting civilian infrastructure during an armed conflict. Bridges that carry both military supplies and ordinary daily traffic sit in a genuine legal gray zone, one that lawyers and human rights observers are actively debating right now in real time as this war continues. Iran's strikes on a Kuwaiti desalination plant raise the exact same uncomfortable questions, just pointed in the opposite direction. Neither side in this conflict has a fully clean record when it comes to keeping the fighting away from people who have nothing to do with it. That's not a small detail to gloss over on the way to the next headline. It's actually a huge part of why this war feels different from a purely military standoff between two governments, because more and more, it's civilians on both sides of the map who are absorbing the cost of decisions being made in war rooms far above their heads. International legal experts have pointed out that the Geneva Conventions and their later protocols specifically forbid attacks on civilian infrastructure, but they also allow for what's sometimes called dual-use targeting, when a piece of infrastructure serves both civilian and military purposes at the same time. A bridge that carries school buses in the morning and military convoys at night falls into exactly that murky category, and it's precisely why both the United States and Iran can point to the same set of facts and argue completely opposite conclusions about who is following the rules of war and who isn't. That ambiguity doesn't make either side automatically right. It just means the legal debate over this campaign is likely to continue long after the strikes themselves have stopped. Quick pause before we keep going. If this breakdown is actually helping you follow a story that most channels either rush through or blow completely out of proportion, share it with someone who's been asking you what's really going on in the Gulf right now. That's honestly the best way to support videos like this one. It's also worth zooming out to think about who else is watching this unfold beyond just Washington and Tehran. Every major economy on the planet has a direct stake in what happens to the Strait of Hormuz. China imports a massive share of its crude oil through this exact waterway. European economies still recovering from earlier energy shocks in recent years are watching shipping insurance rates and fuel prices climb with every new round of strikes. India, which depends heavily on Gulf oil to power its growing economy, has quietly increased diplomatic contact with Gulf states throughout this crisis. None of these countries are directly part of the fighting, but all of them feel it the moment tanker traffic slows down or insurance premiums spike for ships willing to enter the region at all. And that's the strange nature of a choke point conflict like this one. You don't have to be anywhere near the Persian Gulf to feel its effects show up at your local gas pump within a matter of weeks. Shipping companies have already started rerouting some vessels around the region entirely, adding days to journeys and pushing up costs that eventually land on ordinary consumers everywhere, not just in the countries involved in the fighting. Insurance underwriters who specialize in war risk have reportedly raised premiums for any tanker willing to enter the Gulf at all, and some smaller shipping firms have simply stopped taking the risk altogether, choosing longer, safer routes instead. That kind of quiet, almost invisible economic pressure rarely makes headlines the way a missile strike does, but over weeks and months it reshapes global trade in ways that outlast the war itself. Oil markets have reacted with the kind of nervous volatility you'd expect prices climbing on days when strikes intensify and easing slightly whenever there's a lull, traders around the world watching this single stretch of water as closely as any general in the region. Before we get into where this realistically goes from here, if this kind of grounded, no-spin breakdown is what you actually come here for, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you don't miss the next update. This war is shifting week by week, sometimes day by day, and I would honestly rather you hear the real context from a clear breakdown like this one than piece it together from a dozen chaotic, contradictory headlines. So let's bring everything we've covered together. The bridge is cut off outside Bandar Abbas, a tanker disabled near Karg Island. A desalination plant hit inside Kuwait. A carrier claimed to have survived a massive missile barrage, even if the exact number and the country involved got garbled in the retelling at a podium in Turkey. What does all this actually tell us about where this war is headed next? The first thing it tells us is that this conflict has officially moved past the phase of hitting only weapons and defenses. For months, this campaign followed a fairly predictable rhythm. Coastal radar stations. Patrol clears throat boats. Command centers. Missile storage sites. Bridges are a completely different category of target entirely. They are not weapons. They are not military installations in the traditional sense of the word. They are the physical connective tissue that lets an entire country function day to day, moving fuel, food, and yes, military supplies, but also just people getting to work and goods getting to market on time. Once infrastructure like that becomes a normal repeated target instead of a rare one-time event, something fundamentally changes in the character of a war. You can rebuild trust after a missile exchange between two militaries facing off against each other. It is far harder to rebuild trust after a country's basic transportation network has been deliberately taken apart piece by piece over the course of months. That's really the thread connecting every single piece of what we've discussed. Command centers hit to break Iran's ability to coordinate its forces. A naval blockade reimposed to choke off everything that moves by sea. Bridges destroyed to choke off everything that moves by land. Desalination plant damaged inside an allied nation as retaliation for all of it. Each of these events taken on its own might look like a separate, isolated headline that fades from memory within a day or two. Together, they form one single coherent pattern, a war that has expanded from targeting an enemy's weapons to targeting the very systems that keep an entire country, and increasingly its neighbors running. So where does this realistically go from here? Analysts studying the pattern generally point to a few possible paths forward, and it's worth being completely honest that none of them come with any kind of guarantee attached. The first path is a slow, grinding move toward de-escalation, sustained pressure. The blockade, the falling missile rate, the destroyed bridges could eventually force Iran back to a negotiating table, but from a far weaker position than it held even a couple of months ago. The second path is a prolonged standoff. Neither side fully backs down. Both sides settle into a long, tense rhythm of limited strikes and limited responses. The third path is further escalation. Infrastructure attacks continue expanding on both sides. What's clear is that this conflict is permanently changed shape. One last thought before you go. Keep watching for those details, not just the headlines, and you'll understand where this is really heading before most people do.